All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you to all of you joining us live for today's Lunch and Learn, New England Feeding New England. And thank you to everyone who is watching this recording on YouTube. What would it take for the 6 New England states to provide 30% of their food from regional farms and fisheries by 2030? We need resilient and reliable food supply chains, economically viable and competitive producers and processors and distributors and realtors. Oh, they're probably helpful too, but I meant to say retailers. Equitable access to healthy food. A few years ago, the New England State Food System Partners Program launched New England Feeding New England. It's a 10-year initiative to prepare the region for system shocks, such as climate-related weather events and public health emergencies. We have Tanya Swain from the Maine Food Strategy Network here with us to walk us through that collaboration and what it means for all of us. We had hoped to see Leah Rovner today. Unfortunately, she's not able to join us, but I'm glad to see her face on this slide, if not in the presentation today. So my name is Kathleen Neal. I'm the Senior Director of Policy and Partnerships here at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 13,000 members and supporters dedicated to building a just, thriving future for all by acting on the climate crisis, protecting the environment, and safeguarding our democracy. MCA does that by bringing people and organizations together to educate, inspire, and advocate, and MCV by advocating for equitable policies, holding elected officials accountable, and winning elections. Since 2020, this weekly online Lunch and Learn series has helped us advance all of those goals, creating a shared space to explore our environmental and social history, our policy priorities, climate action movement, and more. Thank you for being on this journey with us. A few notes before we dive in. We will hear from Tanya first and then tackle your questions in the Q&A session at the end. You don't have to wait, though. You can send your questions either to me or to Maggie through the chat whenever they occur to you. We will compile them and synthesize them and ask as many as possible following the presentation. If you have any technical difficulties today, Maggie is the one who can help you out. Just send her a message through the chat. She'll come to the rescue. This event is being recorded and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon. You can also find recordings of all of our programs on YouTube. There are a bunch of different playlists, so you can really zero in on the topics you're most interested in. Thank you all for joining us. And Tanya, I will turn it over to you to kick us off.
Great. Thanks very much, Kathleen, and thanks everyone for being here today. My name is Tanya Swain. I'm the project director for Maine Food Strategy. We're a statewide food systems planning initiative that brings together cross-sector organizations to work on collaborative projects, policy, and educational outreach on issues impacting food systems. Next slide, please. Maine Food Strategy is a partner in the New England Food System Planners Partnership, which is spearheading the project I'll be talking about today. Quick note for those of you expecting to also hear from Leah, as Kathleen mentioned, she wasn't able to join us, but we're going to have contact information for her at the end of the presentation. The partnership is comprised of 6 state-level food system planning initiatives working in each of the New England states. We collaborate with Food Solutions New England and their regional network and with each of the New England states' agricultural agencies. In 2019, the partnership began developing the concept for a project that would enhance and build regional partnerships that support New England food value chains. Our initial reason for developing the project was concerns about climate change and impacts on the food supply chain. And then in 2021, the pandemic further validated the need for a coordinated regional effort to build food value chains in and serving New England. Next slide, please. The partnership is part of a collective effort many groups in New England are supporting to expand and fortify the region's food supply and distribution systems. Many of these groups are concerned about equity and justice issues that intersect with food system issues and are working towards changes to ensure communities across the region have access to adequate, affordable, socially and culturally appropriate products, especially in light of changing climate, environmental, and public health conditions. In 2021, we launched New England Feeding New England, a 10-year initiative to amplify these efforts and to establish a goal that by 2030, 30% of the food consumed in New England is produced here. To better understand opportunities for policies and investments to support this goal, the partnership worked with a regional team of researchers to develop foundational research on the existing food system landscape. Next slide, please. New England Feeding New England, a regional approach to food system resilience, was released last spring. The full body of research has 4 volumes with extensive data. The executive summary captures key findings from the research, and we have additional volumes and supplements that look at resilient eating patterns, food production, economic impacts, market channels, seafood, and common food system challenges across the region. Next slide, please. For today's presentation, we're going to look at key findings from the NEFNI research. I'm going to talk a little bit about resilient eating and regional self-reliance. We're going to look at some data to help us understand what's happening with food systems in Maine and the region. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the 2022 Local Food Count Survey. Next slide, please. So before we dig into highlights from the report, I want to touch on 2 key concepts that inform how we're thinking about the 30% by 2030 goal. The first is the concept of resilience. We think about resilience in terms of society's collective ability to respond and recover from adverse conditions. In the case of food systems, this might relate to the capacity an area has to create local distribution systems if global supply chains are disrupted, like from natural disasters or the pandemic. Or this could apply to actions farmers might undertake to prepare for climate change impacts, such as drought, excessive rainfall, or new pests. Another concept underpinning research in the report is resilient eating. Volume 1 of the report is focused on this area and considers changes New Englanders would need to make to their diet and food production to support better nutrition, greater food security, and stronger local food supply chains. We'll look at this concept more closely a few slides down in today's presentation. Next slide, please. So starting with volume 1, with resilience and resilient eating in mind, the report calculated what the average diet would look like if New Englanders were following resilient eating. We're going to talk a little bit more about what resilient eating looks like in a later slide, excuse me. In volume 1 of the report, we found that a shift to resilient eating would reduce the average person's consumption 600 calories per day. Nobody likes to hear that, but in fact, it is a healthier diet. So not surprisingly, this would mean a significant increase in fruits, vegetables, and healthy proteins such as seafood, and reducing consumption of processed foods and beverages. Next slide, please. In volume 2, we explored how much land we would need to put into production to achieve the 30% by 2030 goal. It turns out quite a bit, close to 1 million acres, researchers estimate, would need to be added to production. 400,000 acres could come from existing underutilized farmland, and an additional 588,000 acres from cleared land that is likely land that was once in agricultural production and is now in early stages of returning to tree growth. Next slide, please. In volume 3, we explored the economic impact of New England's food system using in-plan modeling software and found that New England's food system employs 1 million people and generates approximately $190 billion in annual sales. This means that about 10% of jobs in the region, or about 1 in 100, are connected to the food system. While the food system plays an important role in the economy, we also found that employment and sales figures in agriculture and fisheries were flat during the study period. And this was the period we looked at was census data from 2007 to 2012. Next slide, please. And then finally, in volume 4, we explored all the different kinds of market channels in our region and considered which ones offer the greatest opportunity to source more local and regional food for regional consumers. Hands down, grocery stores, restaurants, and warehouse clubs are places New Englanders buy the most food. $71.5 billion of New England food sales, or about 84% of total food sales, are made in these venues. Next slide, please. So now we're going to go back to the idea of resilient eating and what that might look like. So this slide looks at data connected to both the areas, or the next few slides are going to look at both the areas of resilient diet and something called a resiliency indicator. Resilient eating, again, means choosing more nutritional, locally grown and produced foods that support farms, fisheries, and food businesses in Maine and New England. By eating local, we strengthen producers, processors, and food supply chains in our region. This slide illustrates the difference between the average New Englander's typical diet right now and how it would change if an individual ate a diet that supports greater resiliency. The unchanged eating graph on the left is what we're typically eating now. So most of us are spending about a quarter of our daily calories on grains, a little less than a quarter on proteins, and almost a fifth on added fats, oils, and butter. Over 10% of our calories are coming from sugars, and the remaining 25% or so from dairy, fruits, and vegetables. A resilient diet, which is the graph that you see on the right, is based on assumptions about the average calories and types of food the typical New Englander would consume for good nutrition and eating more products from New England. As we looked at in an earlier slide, a more resilient diet would involve fewer calories, about 600 less per day, and many of these calories would need to come from foods with less added fats and sugars. Next slide, next slide, please. So the next couple of slides we're going to look at have to do with the concept of regional self-reliance and trying to calculate what that looks like, sort of where are we at right now. The resilient diet makes estimates based on the number and types of pounds of food the average New Englander would need for a healthy diet. A related estimate we look at is the level of self-reliance the region currently has for different types of food groups. In volume 2, researchers calculated an indicator called regional self-reliance for these different food groups. They calculated the pounds per year for different food groups that New Englanders would consume if we were eating a resilient diet. And then they compared these against the total pounds already produced for each food group in the region. And this calculator results in a regional self-reliance indicator. So the next slide is going to look at these a little bit more deeply for the different food groups. And when we look at these indicators, keep in mind that they illustrate the potential for self-reliance. For some groups, we produce here a lot of what we could consume, but most of the product is exported out of the region. An example is going to be seafood. We're going to look at that more closely. And for some groups, the indicators show we currently produce very little of the food we would need if more New Englanders were eating a resilient diet. Next slide, please. So on this chart, what you guys see is in the left-hand column, a list of food groups. And then if you move right to the next column, we see calculations of the average calories for each food group that are currently produced within the region. And I'm sorry, I keep saying calories, but it's actually pounds. Moving another column to the right under mean consumption are the average pounds researchers calculate New Englanders would consume for each food group if we were eating a resilient diet. And then the last column shows how much we could consume. Across all the food groups, overall, this number is about 20%, a little bit over, from the period 2010 to 2019. And this represents what we already produce here that could be consumed here. Currently, some of what we produce is exported out of the region, and in some cases, similar products to what we produce here are imported in. The percentages on the right represent the upper bound of the regional self-reliance indicator, since the production in New England is not always available in the same form or at the same time of year that consumers want it. And the concerns such as these were beyond the scope of the researchers and the analysis. And so also looking more closely, you can see variability between food groups. The region was most self-reliant in dairy and vegetables, and least self-reliant in sweeteners, fats, oils, and grains. Next slide, please. So this next slide drills down a little bit more deeply into the protein subgroup. What you see here is regional self-reliance indicators for different protein sources. In the top section of the slide, which is from the last table we looked at, you see the regional self-reliance indicator for protein. And this suggests that New England already produces 4.1% of the protein that could be consumed here. The graph breaks this down by protein sources. And so here you can actually see that for seafood, the indicator is 31.8%, which would suggest that we're already landing enough here to satisfy what folks in the region want to eat. Similarly, we produce almost 1/5 of the eggs we could consume if all the eggs were produced here. If all the eggs produced here were sold and consumed here. So for both seafood and eggs, we have a lot happening in the region, but a lot of it's actually getting exported out of the region and not consumed here. And then comparatively for pork, chicken, and turkey, you see that these are all below 1%, which indicates that there's more demand for these products than we currently are able to supply within the region. Next slide, please. This slide is a little bit challenging to read because of the small print, but the highlight here is around the total live pounds harvested of seafood and the total value. So what you're seeing in this slide is that from 2010 to 2020, we see total live pounds of harvested seafood landed decrease by over 25%. And why that's important, of course, in relation to the last slide, is that we have a lot of potential with seafood. We're exporting a lot of it out of the region, but even if we were to keep more of it here, it seems that our landings are decreasing over time. And at the same time, the value of those landings is increasing, probably not surprisingly, but we are seeing seafood get more expensive. Couple other things I wanted to just note with this is that one of the things we hear anecdotally about challenges for local seafood is that some of the species fishermen catch in abundance aren't species that people are familiar with. For example, monkfish. So as consumers, as much as we can eat what's in season when it's in season and look at ways to cook different types of fish, that's something we can do to support the local food system. And I just wanted to put a little plug in here for Maine Coast Fishermen's Association, Gulf of Maine Research Institute, and Sea Maine, which are 3 organizations, and there's others in the state, supporting Maine seafood and aquaculture industries. Next slide, please. So probably not surprisingly, one of the factors affecting New England's fishery is climate change. In 2020, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, found that about 10% of Maine's seafood catch was classified as having very high or high vulnerability from factors associated with climate change. Next slide, please. So the next few slides talk a little bit about the economy. We've looked at what a resilient diet might look like in terms of production and some of the challenges with meeting caloric needs. This slide illustrates the potential economic impact of more New Englanders consuming a resilient diet compared to our current diet choices, and looks at projections for production and employment in 2030. Under the unchanged eating scenario, total farm production measured as sales or output in the case of support for crop and animal production is projected to rise to $4.1 billion in 2030 from $2.1 billion in 2017. This is an increase at a compound annual rate of 5.3% per year, which reverses the region's declining performance during this period in crop and animal production. With the exception of dairy and milk, which remains largely unchanged, our farming sectors are projected to grow at moderate or strong rates. In particular, grain and oilseed farming, cattle ranching, and poultry and egg production would see increases by a factor of 4 to 5 times the 2017 values. Under the assumptions of the resilient eating dietary pattern, total output of all farming and support activities rises to $5.5 billion, about 1/3 greater than under the unchanged eating assumption, and with a growth rate of nearly 8% per year over the 2017 values. We estimate that farm sales will grow by 195% to 261%, depending on the scenario. This increase in sales will demand more production and more jobs. With our current diet, estimates call for 6,000 more jobs to meet demand. If New Englanders shift towards a more resilient eating scenario, over 9,000 net jobs would need to be created by 2030, which is just around the corner. These estimates hit up against the workforce issues producers and businesses across the supply chain are experiencing. Also, farmers and commercial fishers continue to age, and the lack of diversity in these occupations calls for increased attention to supporting both youth and individuals of color to be competitive and gaining access to opportunities and resources to start and operate businesses. Next slide, please. So some of what we know, keeping these concepts of resilient diet and regional self-reliance in mind. The next slide, or this slide, illustrates conditions in our current food system that impact, the next few slides are going to illustrate conditions that impact our ability to improve in these areas. And some of what we know right now is New England's food system makes a significant contribution to the regional economy and represents an opportunity, some of what we just talked about. We can't supply enough food today for the region, and we don't know how much of the food produced in New England stays here right now. And there are real barriers to entry and expansion for smaller businesses, and there's a need for skilled labor in the food supply chain, and that's going to increase. Next slide, please. So the next few slides are going to talk a little bit about what we're seeing in agriculture, which is obviously super critical to this idea of meeting a 30 by 30 goal. It feels like there's an opportunity when we think about that last slide we looked at around the economics, but not unlike seafood, where we were seeing decreasing landings and flat employment, Maine and New England agriculture is struggling. Relative to the rest of the country, agriculture in New England is very small. The average size of a farm in Maine in 2017 was about 170 acres, while nationally average farm size is 441 acres. Maine had the most land in agriculture and the second highest value of sales in the New England region, but nationally sales in New England make up less than 1% of total national ag sales. Next slide, please. So this is something we think a lot about, is where our farms are at. As I mentioned, New England farms are very small, not necessarily a bad thing, but about 85% had sales of less than $50,000 in 2017 and negative average net profits. And this same pattern exists in Maine. So this is a slide on New England farms, but you can see the same thing in each of the states. A few big farms make up most of agricultural sales in the region, with a little more than 3% of New England farms accounting for 69% of total ag sales. Our biggest New England farms are small on a national scale. So our biggest farms were making up to $771,000 average net profits, really small compared to a national scale. We do also know, not surprisingly, net returns are greater on average for farms with larger gross sales. And we've been seeing declines in mid-sized farms for a long time. All of our farms in New England are going to be important to meeting that 30% goal. Next slide, please. In this slide, we see a little bit about demographics in farming. Production on New England farms is not reflective of demographics in the region. In 2020, people of color in New England comprised over 28% of the region's population, but owned just 4.9% of farms and 2.5% of farmland. In 2017, from the census over 5 years or so ago, about 62% of farmers in the region were also over the age of 55. Next slide, please. So in light of these trends, it's understandable that the region is facing a dramatic decline in land use for agriculture. This chart illustrates the decline in land in cropland and pasture and rangeland in New England from 1945 on the left to 2012 on the right. Loss of land for production represents a significant barrier to achieving greater food system resilience in New England. Next slide, please. Our NEFNI researchers estimate the region would need to add 590,000 new acres of farmland and bring another 400,000 acres of existing farmland back into production. This means a total increase of 990,000, almost 1 million acres in production, which is a land area roughly the size of New England. This slide focuses on the land base for agriculture, but it's important to note that we're also losing working waterfront for fisheries and need to preserve commercial landing sites in the region as well. Next slide, please. Another projection related to the loss of farmland and the need to find ways to stem that tide. A 2020 American Farmland Trust report projected over 267,000 acres of New England farmland may be converted to other uses by 2040. And that projection includes over 53,000 acres under threat in Maine right now. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to shift a little bit to talk about another part of the food supply chain, which is where we buy food. There's an interesting dichotomy with most farms losing money while Maine has the second highest per capita food expenditures in the US. The first state, if anybody's wondering, is Colorado. If you bought groceries recently in other states, you might have noticed this. We see here that types of food Northeast consumers purchase most are concentrated among ultra-processed food and beverage products, which were the top 3 food expenditure categories for our state. And this is true of the other parts of New England as well. Next slide, please. So where do we buy our food? And again, this slide is a chart of what's going on in Maine, but if you take this and you show the same chart in other states with their data, it's a very similar configuration. In Maine, in 2017, we spent over $7 billion on food. More than half of that money was spent at grocery stores. Over a third was spent at restaurants, both full service and fast food. Direct sales from farmer to consumer, our farm markets and our farm stands, made up less than 1% of total retail sales. The dark orange block in the bottom row of this chart represents food service contracts, which many people are working on, which would be like institutional buying. It's about 1.6% of total food sales. That would represent sales to, when we think of institutions, it could include healthcare facilities, prisons, schools, those types of organizations. One thing that's completely clear from this chart and from what we've seen in the other New England states is that the only way we're going to achieve 30% of regional food consumption is to find ways to increase local and regional food sourcing in the grocery store and restaurant market channels. Next slide, please. So this is a little pullout on institutional sales. Even though institutional sales make up a small percentage of total sales, There are over 20,000 institutions in New England, and regionally, institutions represent less than 4% of food and beverage sales, but 25% of the population spends time in an institution every day. So there seem to be some opportunities here. There's some great organizations working on this, and it's just another area for potential growth. Next slide, please. I think this slide is really interesting. This illustrates where we spend that 50% of food dollars that we're spending at grocery stores. We saw in an earlier slide that the top 3 food expenditures in Maine are on ultra-processed foods and beverages. And then you see in this slide that dollar stores make up the largest number of grocery stores in New England, 914. And groceries in these stores are predominantly processed foods. Next slide, please. So this brings us to a project that the NEFNI partners are working on right now. One of the things we've realized is that as a region, we don't really know at this point what's produced in each of our states that's actually consumed in each of our states. And it's hard to get a handle on whether we're meeting goals and what the trends are until we can figure this out. The New England State Food System Planners Partnership is in the process of doing what we call a local food count study on 2002 data from retailers, distributors, and other food businesses across the region to try to understand this. This is the first of its kind study in the New England states. Vermont's already done a similar study 4 times over the past decade. And we're hoping with this happening in all the New England states, we'll create alignment across our region and a system that can be used to gather consistent data in each state every 3 years. Next slide, please. And this is an example of some of the information that Vermont has gleaned from the 4 studies that they've been able to do over the last decade. This graphic illustrates total food purchases during the 4 years the Vermont study was conducted. It might be a little hard to see some of the details in this slide, but what you're seeing through the shading in the graphics is an increase in the percentage of total food purchases in Vermont between 2010 and 2020. And their data shows an increase from 5% in 2010 to just over 16% in 2020. And then the red line that runs across the rectangular graphs at the top represents the dollar amount Vermonters would spend if they're spending 30% of their food expenditures on products from Vermont. And Vermont is estimating that this is about $527.3 million. Next slide, please. So a few more slides sort of towards the end and a little bit of wrap up. Some of the areas that the partnership and the NEFNI project is working on right now. We're participating in a subgroup working to develop food system strategies that align with Maine's climate plan and a goal of 30% of the food consumed in Maine produced in the state. We're in the process of discussing next steps for local food count studies following this year's study, which is on 2022 data. We're hoping to replicate that in 2026, so we start to have some comparisons across the region. And we're monitoring funding opportunities for food systems development. Some of you may be aware that there's been some great resources coming in from the federal government and other resources to support agriculture, food processing, and some of the other points along the supply chain. Next slide, please. So if we have a call to action, one of the highlights would be for folks to just choose local when you can afford to, where you can find it. Buy and eat more food grown, harvested, and produced within Maine and New England. And ultimately, when we do this, it helps to support our local businesses and it builds our food system here. And next slide, please. A few other ways to get involved if you're interested in the NEFNI project. The report in all of its different chapters and volumes is available online. I can put a link to that in the chat when we get done with the presentation. It's great data to use if you're working in an organization that's doing any issue stuff related to food systems, or if you're working with policymakers and you want some background information to help make the case for why this stuff is important. Also great if your organization is working on food systems to align behind the 20 or the 30 by 2030 goal and see what you can do to help support that. We love sharing this information with groups. So if you have an opportunity for us to present, we'd love to hear that and get in front of your organization. And then finally, we have a monthly newsletter and folks are welcome to subscribe to that. There's a link on the NEFNI website, which again, I'll put in the chat in a moment. Next slide, please. So finally, thank you all for listening through that presentation, very data heavy. If anybody is interested in more information on the NEFNI project, here is contact information for Leah Rovner, our project director, and my contact information at the Maine Food Strategy is on this slide as well. You can find all this stuff online and we can put some stuff in the chat as well. So thank you very much for being here today. Appreciate the opportunity.
Oh my goodness, Tanya, thank you. What an incredible presentation. I really need to spend more time with all of that data. And just so everybody knows, you will get a follow-up email this afternoon with the link to the recording and all of those resources that Tanya shared, as well as contact information for both Tanya and Leah. Thank you for doing double duty today. Tanya was seamless, and we are so grateful. There are a ton of good questions, and everybody, you can keep on sending those to me and to Maggie. Let's get into it. From health to the economy, to demographics, to land use, to climate impacts, it seems like this work touches everything. And I'm just really curious about the composition of, how do you keep the frame both wide enough to encompass everything that our food systems touch, and focused enough to be able to make these concrete recommendations and conclusions? Will you take us pull the curtain back on the process a little bit?
Sure. I mean, I think I said this at the beginning of the presentation, but it's really true. I mean, this is a collective effort. There are many, many, many groups across the region that have been concerned and started to focus on food systems, and there's some that have been focusing on this for decades. And so I think our job at the partnership and as part of the NEFNI project is to really amplify some of the information that supports the issues those groups are working on. And then to also try to help us to continue to understand more deeply what's really going on. I think a great example of that is, I know for me, I've been working on food systems issues pretty focused for about a decade. And the information that comes out on farms and agriculture, we need to understand that's a struggle, and I don't think have figured out for those of us trying to support that area what exactly we should be doing to make that better. So I think at that kind of broad scale, at that big picture level, some of what we want to do is to highlight those issues. And then there's many groups, again, working on this that can drill down on that a little bit more specifically.
Thank you. It clearly takes the work of so many different people with so many different areas of expertise that are intersecting here. So thank you for sharing all of this and being the voice for all of that, those integrated ways of thinking. There are so many things that I think have become a little more evident in the last few years, as somebody who didn't really ever think about supply chains before about 4 years ago. Some of the benefits of local food, of New England feeding New England, have come into a little bit more stark relief in the last few years. How do you think both climate and public health and all of the sort of intersecting crises that we face are elevating the importance of this work right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So the concept for the New England Feeding New England project really started before the pandemic. A group of our state initiatives were at an event talking about the work that we were trying to do, thinking about some of what we had started to see more frequently around natural disasters from climate change, and thinking, how does that affect the food supply chain in New England? What happens if, we see this all the time now, something happens in another part of the country where there's a lot of food production, and lo and behold, we don't have some of the food that we thought we were going to have access to because we're all reliant on that global food supply chain. So that was kind of before the pandemic. And I'm now actually swaying, Kathleen, from your question. I've lost my train of thought. Can you reiterate that a little bit so I don't get completely off track here?
No, I appreciate it, and it's not a particularly well-formed question, so so it might be me here. Um, I'm just thinking about, there was a question in the chat about, was there a point in time when New England was feeding itself? And maybe I'll just ask that instead. Where
Yeah,
did we
I mean, I
start
think
and what happened?
you can see from the slide that we pulled up that talks about the conversion of farmland from 1945 to present. You can just see that decline. So this has been going on for decades. I think that folks that study this would say some of this has to do with consolidation that's happened in the food system, both around large farms as well as along the whole supply chain. So in some cases, we have companies that control multiple parts of the supply chain, which makes it hard for the types of producers that we have in New England, which have tended to be a little bit smaller and connected in different ways to those supply chains to be able to compete. So farms have just continued to get smaller, which isn't a bad thing, but those smaller farms have a harder time selling into like wholesale and distributors. And that's where most people are getting their food when it ends up at a grocery store or a restaurant. So over time, we've seen that market share for farms start to decline, and that makes it challenging, especially for mid-scale farms. And like I mentioned in Maine, our largest farms are still really small farms by national standards. So they are trying to compete in that same world, and it's very challenging.
You mentioned the stores where we're getting most of our food, and I just have to ask you about that slide with the Dollar Tree as the top food store. Please tell me that that number of stores doesn't correlate to the amount of our food that's purchased there.
Well, it's interesting. When we were putting together the NEFNI report, before all of the data had actually gotten in front of us as partners, the folks that were putting it together were saying, "Hey, can you guys get pictures of Dollar Tree stores and these stores in your areas?" And we were thinking, why? But as it turns out, there's a lot of food that moves through those stores, and as it also turns out, a lot of the food that we're eating in Maine is ultra processed food. So that correlates. People have access to those grocery stores, and they're not going to find fresh produce there, and they're not going to find stuff, to the best of my knowledge, from local producers. Yes, pretty interesting. And so, the other thing that we look at is just the amount of consolidation that's happened in the grocery industry and how that also affects the ability of stores to be able to carry products. So those stores have different distribution channels and different supply chains, although many of them are trying to carry and continue to try to increase the amount of local food that they carry. So that's a positive thing.
You hear about food deserts as part of the explanation for where people are able to get food, just the choices that are available. Is that a factor in Maine, do you think?
For sure. I mean, I live in Farmington. I mean, we're surrounded by rural communities where you often don't have a grocery store in that town or, several miles away. And a lot of those stores that you're going to find are going to be really small. Um, and are probably not going to be carrying much, if any, fresh produce. And if that's what people have access to, and especially everybody that's busy and trying to, make ends meet, that's where they're going to end up buying food. That's what the choices are. So, food deserts for sure are part of this. Again, around getting people across the state, across the region to think about why we want to support local food, why we want to buy more of it. A piece of that is just looking at the stores that we already have, our independent grocers and producers and stores. They have some flexibility to be able to work with local farmers and producers more. So that's a real actual opportunity.
Access and availability is clearly part of the story, but food prices have to be too, right? And we've got anecdotal experience shared in the chat here that Maine local food at farmers markets, sometimes is expensive, sometimes is more expensive. How do we factor that in, and how can we support more people to have affordable access to healthy local food? Is that part of this project as well?
I would say that some of the data touches on that. And I would also say that there's some great organizations across New England and in Maine that are working at trying to figure that out. It is admittedly a challenge to figure out how to match up the prices that farms need to charge for their produce to make a living with what people can afford, or how to make those products competitive in like the grocery store, or if they're trying to sell to a restaurant or a school or any other entity. There are some projects in Maine. One of the interesting projects I'm aware of is called the Maine Marinara Collaborative, which right now is looking at developing a fresh, a sauce made from fresh Maine products that would be processed in Maine and sold to Maine schools. And they're trying to figure out how to do that in a way that makes economic sense. And they're also some of the partners in that project are also involved in a project that involves greens. And it's using some greens that I think are upcycled from another product to be able to produce a product that is lower cost for folks that want to use greens in cooking. And actually, just putting in a little bit of a plug on that topic, Maine Food Strategy is part of a collaborative that puts together a webinar series called Selling More Maine Foods every year. Our next one is at the end of March, and it's on upcycled food products. So it's on looking at food products that come out of like a food manufacturing process that might typically be thrown away or discarded, and how those can be used in other products or by other companies to make other products. It doesn't necessarily get at the affordability piece, but hopefully creating more efficiency, at least in the supply chain.
That sounds amazing, and we can definitely include a link to that in the follow-up email this afternoon, because there are just so many different layers here. So let's bring it back to the individual layer for a second. How do you think we how can an individual help with this mission to preserve land for farming, and then to help make those farms more viable? And just as a preview, I'm going to ask you the same question about the state government and the federal government, but we're going to start with individuals.
Okay. So I think for the average person, again, you mentioned prices, and that is a concern for many, many consumers, is how expensive food can be. I think when we can choose local, if we can afford it, or if there's products available, if we have that opportunity, the more we choose to buy those products, the more it's going to continue to support our businesses in the state and help those businesses grow and expand. So that's one way for the average consumer. And sometimes folks don't realize that even when you go to like a Hannaford and you're buying a brand like, one of the organic milk products or some of the cheeses that are there, those products are using inputs from Maine dairy producers, for example. So sometimes when you're buying products that are regional, they may not say Maine specifically. It's still a way to support that overall supply chain. And, obviously for folks that have the time and capacity and resources to shop at farm stands and farm markets, that's great. The vast majority of the farms in Maine are really small, and we need all of them to be able to figure out how to strengthen this.
I'm counting the days until my local farmers market starts up again for the summer. So thank you for reminding me that that's on the horizon. What about policies, right? We talk so much in the climate action work about, yes, individual responsibility plays a role, but let's not ignore the fact that policy makes a really big difference. What kinds of policies do you think could help, either at the state or the federal level, making our food systems more resilient?
I think policy is huge. Before I address that, though, I wanted to make one more note about what consumers can do that I meant to mention, which is seafood. Um, Buying local seafood, in-season seafood, trying different kinds of fish, that's all also really, really important. Seafood is important. Aquaculture is important, especially when we're looking at proteins as part of our nutritional needs. So in terms of policy at the state level, one of the areas that we've been thinking about and focusing on, and this is very small, has to do with Maine being able to develop a local food definition in statute. And this might not seem like a big deal, but the reason that it is just, for example, when we try to figure out what are we consuming in the region that's produced here, and we're going to retailers and saying, can you tell us what you're selling that's produced in Maine? They all have different definitions. Sometimes they don't have any definition. And it's really hard to get good data and track these things when we don't have agreement on what is local. Vermont is the only state in New England that has a definition in statute. So again, this seems like a minor thing, but in terms of measuring, and if you believe that you get what you measure, it's an important piece. And then at the federal level, we've been fortunate to see a lot of resources coming in for food supply chains through the federal government that the state has put out in grants and loans. And there's been quite a bit of support in recent years. I think the biggest thing is just policies that pertain to supporting those smaller scale local and regional producers so that they can compete. If they want to grow, that they can expand. The system isn't really set up to support some of these smaller growers, and that's one of the things that's happened. I mean, even if you look at like the history of crop insurance, for example, and some of the other resources that are available to different types of producers. So the policies that come through the Farm Bill, for example, that address some of those areas are really important.
Thank you for saying those words, Tanya. We've done a couple of programs focusing on aspects of the Farm Bill. And so I think this group probably knows that Congress is, shocker, way behind on development of the Farm Bill, and that it, as you mentioned, the difference between farms in Maine and farms nationwide is significant. And a lot of our farmers don't necessarily benefit from those crop insurance and commodity crop benefits that dominate in other parts of the country. So it's all continuing to come together. That definition of local food, that seems both really important and really achievable. Should we keep an eye out, or do you expect legislation to be introduced perhaps next session about defining local food, and how can we help?
I think what we're doing at this point is, along with some other partners that are really interested in this, is trying to start to develop that conversation. We have had some definitions in statute in the past, from my understanding, that have ended up getting, I think it's overturned is the correct language, but so it's actually more difficult than you might think, because obviously when you're nailing down what a definition of local food is, there may be folks that are somewhere on the fringes of that, that feel like that's going to jeopardize their business or their interests. So as all of these things always are, it's never as easy as it may sound. But definitely, yeah, if your listeners can keep an eye open and ear out for things that might be moving in that area, and would be willing to support that, that would be great.
I have a feeling you'll find lots of folks ready to spring into action. So keep us posted, and we will make sure that information gets to the rest of the group as quickly as we can. We have so many questions here that we are not going to get a chance to ask today, but I am just so grateful to you for sharing all of this research, and we'll share out all of this information in the afternoon email. Tanya, what's next for New England Feeding New England? What's the next step in this collaboration?
Well, on a very focused level, we're looking at how to try to put together a local food count study for 2026. It would be on 2025 data that would start to be able to let us see the trends that are happening across the region. So that's one piece that we're doing. And we're also at this stage really in this phase of just getting out information on this report, trying to share the data, getting people to look at it. Because as we talked about earlier, this work is really a collective effort. I mean, no one entity can do this by itself. And the more we can work together and support each other, trying to strengthen food systems, that's the only way we're going to be able to get anywhere with the issues.
We are so grateful to be part of that process. As always, in addition to the other calls to action that you'll see in that follow-up Lunch and Learn email, you can forward that message to anyone and everyone. So share this incredible research with your communities, and we will have more to share soon. So Tanya, thank you so much. Thanks to all of you for joining today. We will be back in this space next week for an interactive climate policy workshop using the MIT Sloan School's En-ROADS Climate Policy Simulator. You may remember exploring En-ROADS in the past, but boy, there are a lot of new policy levers that we can pull. So join us next week. Peter Dugas from Citizens Climate Lobby will be with us, and we'll see what we can do. Till then, have a wonderful local food-filled weekend, and we will see you all again soon. Thanks a bunch.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.